So, hi there everyone, and welcome to this webinar with Social Democratic Friends of Israel. My name is Christopher Aberg, and I'm the president of this organization. We're a Swedish group connected to the Labour Party in Sweden. The Labour Party is the largest party, and we are a subgroup in that party that works with promoting a pro-Israeli message in a social democratic way. And today it's our first webinar. This is going to be a series of many webinars. And today is also our annual meeting, so our members will stay with us in a Zoom meeting after this. But before that, we're going to have this webinar with Luke Akehurst, who is from the organization We Believe in Israel. And I will let you present yourself, and you can also tell about We Believe in Israel, of course, and your work with the Labour Party, and also the connection to, I don't know how it's pronounced, if it's pronounced BICOM or BICOM.
BICOM, yeah. Okay, so my name's Luke Akehurst. I'm the director of We Believe in Israel, which is the kind of campaigning offshoot of an older organization called BICOM, the Britain Israel Communications and Research Centre. So BICOM was founded in response to the terrorism in the Second Intifada, because the media coverage of that in the UK wasn't presenting the reality of what was going on. It was kind of twisted in a way that you couldn't tell that Israeli civilians were the primary victims of the suicide bombings. So people in Britain set up a media organization to try to explain the Israeli side of the story. And then over time that evolved and became something more like a think tank. And then I came in 2011, so nearly a decade ago, to create a grassroots network or movement to enable ordinary citizens of any political party or any religious or ethnic background to express their sympathy towards Israel, particularly to do things like contacting their members of parliament, persuading them to take a better stance. And we now have 24,000 people that we can email from across the UK. About half of those are from the Jewish community. The other half not Jewish, including people like myself. I'm from a secular political background, and that brings me to the other part of this that is relevant to you as social democrats, which is that I'm from the same political family as you. I've been a member of the British Labour Party since I was 16, so 33 years this year. I currently serve on the Labour Party National Executive. That's obviously a separate role to anything that I do that's connected to Israel. I've stood for Parliament. I've been a councillor. Kind of done everything in the party, really. So I'm very clearly someone from the centre left, and that informs my views about the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. That I'm driven by centre left values about self-determination and national rights and human rights of both peoples.
Yeah, great. I actually also get this question all the time when I go on some event and people find out I'm from this pro-Israeli organization, and they ask me all the time if I have a Jewish background, which I don't. So what was the motivation for you to start engaging yourself in this pro-Israeli way?
Yeah, so I don't have any faith background at all. There's no Jewish kind of roots in my family, and I don't come at this. Yeah, there are some people that are pro-Israel for reasons of Christian faith. That's not me. I'm a totally secular person. In fact, a kind of agnostic when it comes to faith. Though obviously, doing this job that relates to Israel, I have to learn a lot about other people's faiths, and I find them fascinating. And I'm interested in faith, but I don't have one myself. the original root of me having any knowledge, sorry, not really knowledge, but sympathy to this was that my grandfather had Jewish friends during his career as a head teacher and in his army unit during World War II, who he kept in touch with. So I had some knowledge. I grew up in a part of the country with no Jewish community at all, but through my grandfather, I kind of knew a little bit about the Jewish community, and he it wasn't like something we talked about a lot, but he emphasized that he felt that we should support the Jewish people because of anti-Semitism, and by extension, we should support Israel's right to exist as well. And then when I got to university, that was the first time I encountered people in the Jewish community my own age, and some of them were involved in the Labour Club at my university in Bristol. Some of them weren't. Some of them were conservatives or liberals or whatever. But we had a shared agenda about being against extremism on campus. So whether that was far right extremism or far left extremism of people pursuing the boycott movement, or of bringing anti-Semitism into the debate about Israel, the same people that were hostile to the Jewish society on the campus were also hostile to me as someone from the centre-left wing of the Labour Party. I think one of the bit of context for people in Sweden to get their heads around is the British Labour Party, because of our electoral system, stretches far wider than the Social Democrats do in Sweden and is less ideologically cohesive. So yeah, we have quite divergent views inside the party, and so some of these people I'm describing as extreme left, in those days they were like mainly in other small far left political parties, but some of them were kind of internal opponents within the Labour Party as well.
All right. So I know that some of the people who told me that they're going to watch this webinar, they're also very actively campaigning on mostly on a grassroots level, I think, for Israel. And you have been the director now for over 10 years for what I understand is the most successful pro-Israeli group in the UK. So what would you say have been most effective, and what advices can you give people on what works and what doesn't work?
Okay, so the gap that we were trying to fill by creating We Believe in Israel, a couple of gaps where the pro-Israel community in the UK was weak 10 years ago. So one of them was ability to mobilize ordinary citizens to speak to politicians, particularly when there's a crisis in the region, when there's a conflict in the region. And so there was this kind of atmosphere created where politicians would get, in those days, letters, now emails from their constituents, and would assume that everyone was completely hostile and anti-Israel. So we wanted to balance that out. So one of the core things we've done is to create a large email list that we've gradually grown over time through campaigns going viral and people signing up, and also, frankly, through just going around and speaking and handing around a sign-up list, and then getting people to receive our emails. We use the emails both to educate our activists and tell them about what's really going on, but also to mobilize them for campaigns. And it's probably less relevant with your election system, but in the UK, as with the US, members of parliament care about their local constituency that they're elected from. So getting people to write to their local member of parliament was essential. I guess you could call it, it's not lobbying like someone that's a professional lobbyist going and speaking to politicians. It's citizen lobbying. It's people who have a vote telling their politicians that they care about something. And then I guess more recently we've tried to do more on social media, and then we've also tried to create networks inside civil society in any organization that might debate the issue of boycott of BDS. So we're trying to create networks inside the trade unions, the churches, in local councils, in the arts and cultural world, anywhere where there's this kind of debate about Israel, we're trying to put together a group of people that can work together to oppose boycotts and to put a more balanced position about Israel.
All right. My impression of pro-Israel organizations is that many of them tend to have a right-wing stance when it comes to the politics. And you have already explained to the viewers that you're from the Labour Party, and We Believe in Israel has a mission of gathering all the political camps that support Israel, and but you also promote the two-state solution and so on.
Yeah.
And myself, I think it's a bit of a tactical mistake to focus so much on the right-wing audience, because they are in many cases already pretty pro-Israel. So what you need to focus on is to make the people who are from socialist or social democratic and green parties to become more pro-Israeli. And there are some examples from the United States. For instance, there was one group called the Israel Project, and they actually had to shut down because they went too much on the conservative side. So people didn't want to support them anymore. And we also have the organization called J Street, which sees itself as a pro-Israeli group, but they are often criticized because they tend to criticize Israel mostly and not support Israel. But you are very clear in supporting Israel. So then my question is, which arguments do you think work extra good when you reach out to an audience that is more on the left or center-left side compared to what a normal pro-Israeli organization is working like?
So I mean, I have the difficult balancing act of bringing together a very broad spectrum of people, from left to right, some of whom I wouldn't agree with on lots of other issues. That's also it's a great experience, because you get to, if you work on a single issue political campaign, it takes you outside of your own political family, your own political party, and you get to find what makes other people tick. But we have a lot of clarity about the core ideological position of the organization, which is the support for a two-state solution, which is also the position of BICOM, and it's the position of the major Jewish communal organizations in the UK. So, for instance, the Board of Deputies, which is the elected kind of council of the Jewish community in the UK, they had a vote recently where they reaffirmed their support for a two-state solution. I would say, actually, even with conservative politicians in the UK, unless you express support for two states, you can't really get. There might be some people right on the fringe of the Conservative Party who are not interested in two-state solution, but most of the MPs, it's their starting point, and that clearly from that flows. You can't be in favour of the occupation of the West Bank, because where's the Palestinian state going to go if it's not going to go in the West Bank and Gaza? And for me, actually, I've had to think during this job quite a lot about what it means to be a Zionist. So I use that word doesn't mean like someone with extreme views on Israel. It means someone who believes that in the Jewish people's right to self-determination and to statehood, and to have their own security in a state. Well, if you believe in that for one people, if you're also an anti-racist, you've got to believe in it for their neighbours as well. And indeed, I would apply it to some other foreign policy situations around the world. So you've got to be consistent. You've got to want the same rights for everyone. If you're from the centre-left, you can't go around advocating the right to statehood for one people and against the rights of statehood for another. So the ideological positioning is a showstopper. Like, if I don't think I'd want to. I wouldn't want to work for an organisation that didn't support two states, and I don't think I would get very far trying to talk to opinion formers or centre left or any audience in the UK if I didn't support that. And we're not trying to tell people to be totally uncritical friends of Israel. So whenever Israel does something that's controversial, we will try to explain why it happened, because often there's a there's a why, and it's often to do with security and terrorism that doesn't always come across in the media in the UK or the rest of Western Europe, and we have to kind of delve into what was the sequence of events and get Israel does an airstrike. Why did it do an airstrike? Was it in response to a rocket attack or whatever? But we're not expecting people that sign up to our email list to feel that they have to go out and kind of cheerlead for every single thing Israel does, because that would be irrational. Most people in the UK or Sweden don't even support everything that their own government does when it comes to security or foreign policy, particularly if they're on the centre left. So expecting them to go, oh, I completely give a blank check to this country that I ideologically believe should exist, that isn't going to happen. And we also have a situation where the government in Israel has been quite right-wing for quite a long time, and I can't expect. I'm not a fan of Netanyahu. That's not who I would vote for the Labour Party, or maybe even for Meretz if I lived in Israel. So I'm not expecting people. If people like him, then they're not Labour people. They're from the Conservative Party or wherever, and they think he's great, then fine. But I can't expect people from the centre left to give a blank check to an Israeli government that isn't the one that they would vote for. We're asking people to sign up to say that they support the right to self-determination of the Jewish people, that therefore they support Israel's right to defend itself and to protect the safety of its people, and that they don't support boycott, divestment and sanctions, because that is an agenda that's completely negative and is about driving the two peoples apart. And the stuff that appeals to people on the centre left in the UK is about bringing the Israelis and the Palestinians together, and also about bringing Jews and Arabs together within pre-1967 Israel. So anything that is to do with coexistence, with peace building, with building understanding between the two sides, usually works. And then it becomes more difficult, because when you get into a conflict situation, like the war that happened in Gaza in 2014, clearly people are going to focus on the violence that's happening and not on the long-term peace building. And there you kind of have to fall back on the more fundamental messages about Israel's right to defend itself.
All right. During the last 5 years, between 2015 and 2020, Jeremy Corbyn was the leader of the Labour Party in UK, and a lot of people who are active in these issues, they know that it was a lot of scandals concerning anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. So can you tell me a little bit about these years and how it was to campaign for a pro-Israeli message during these years?
Yeah, so it really went beyond anything to do with being pro-Israel. We were in a fundamental, so kind of existential fight within the party that was actually about anti-Semitism, pure and simple, about conspiracy theories about Jewish people being promoted that could have come from the protocols of the Elders of Zion, from like a Tsarist forgery, presenting Jewish people as manipulating the political process and the media, Nazi analogies, which are incredibly hurtful for Jewish people to have with Israel and the way it behaves compared to the Nazis. Blood libel about kind of presenting Israel as reveling in killing people, particularly killing children. We're talking a sort of slippage in the discourse into stuff that is overtly anti-Semitic. We're not just talking about problems with people making apartheid analogies or wanting to boycott Israel. And the whole thing got very out of control and kind of spiraled, because when the Jewish community started raising its concerns about this discourse happening inside the Labour Party, in some ways things got worse, because then accusations started floating around about, oh, the Jewish community kind of is trying to stop this moment when socialism could happen, when Jeremy Corbyn is is presenting a new left-wing agenda. There's a conspiracy of Zionists that are trying to attack him because of his views over Palestinians. So he actually started to get like anti-Semitic conspiracy theories as a reaction to people trying to express their concerns about anti-Semitism. You had the leading Jewish MPs in the party. Several of them left the party, including Luciana Berger, who had come up through the same journey through student politics as I had, and including Louise Ellman, who was the chair of the Labour. Well, two of the chairs of the Labour Friends of Israel ended up out leaving the party in protest. So it got very, very bad. I think this is how did this happen? It's partly that Jeremy had personally had a very long-term commitment to the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, which is the main pro-Palestinian organisation in the UK, is heavily involved in that, and heavily involved in the Stop the War coalition, which started off as an anti-Iraq war organisation but became generally about kind of Middle East politics. So he had a politics that was very focused on foreign policy and very, he would describe it as anti-imperialist, so anti-British and American foreign policy, anti-Israel. And Jeremy never really policed the left flank of that set of beliefs. So he didn't say, look, I have this set of beliefs, but if you express them in this way, that's anti-Semitic and you're not an acceptable comrade of mine, or if you express them this way, you're anti-democratic and you're not an exceptional comrade of mine. He had like a no enemies to the left stance. And so then some of those people from the fringe of the left, quite large numbers of them, came into the Labour Party when he became leader because they thought this was their political moment, and brought with them, at the very least, like a kind of radical anti-Israel stance, but a lack of control over that lapsing into anti-Semitism. And then the Labour Party structures, our structures for party discipline, were designed around problems we'd had in the 1980s, which actually I think were mirrored to a lesser extent in Sweden, around infiltration by what was called militant in the UK. I forget what the name was in Sweden, but like a small Trotskyist organisation. So we had good systems for dealing with people that come in from another political tradition. We didn't really have any experience of having to bring disciplinary actions around anti-Semitism. It wasn't something I encountered in the first 25 years I was in the party. It was like out there on the far left, but not inside the party. And suddenly the party's disciplinary processes were swamped by this and couldn't deal with it. And you also had a problem with the people running the party under Jeremy Corbyn, I don't think wanted to deal with it fully, because they were like, well, these people that these accusations or allegations of anti-Semitism being made against are our political allies. They're from our faction in the party. So they weren't keen to take decisive action, and only started taking action when they were really forced into it by the kind of public outcry, particularly from the Jewish community. And it's not an exaggeration to say, we have a Jewish community in the UK that's far larger than in Sweden proportionately. It's about 250,000 people, though. That's still a very small community. That the people inside it feel vulnerable because they're 0.5% of the population, and they community that whose relatives in mainland Europe suffered genocide. So when they start hearing anti-Semitic discourse, this is like a threat to the survival of the community. There was a sense that the Jewish community in France had shrunk very rapidly because of terrorist attacks, and the Jewish community in the UK was getting ready to leave if Corbyn had become Prime Minister, which you can imagine for me as someone that really cares about the Labour Party. It's like you don't become on the national executive of the Labour Party unless you are very, very dedicated to being a party activist, but you don't become the director of a pro-Israel organisation unless you care about Israel and the Jewish community. So I was torn in two by this. This is like the most morally difficult thing that I could face, and explaining rationally, I believed I needed to stay and fight to change the party around. But I wasn't sure if that rational argument cut it morally. And a lot of my Jewish friends, were like, Luke, what are you doing? How can you stay in there? Now they're like, okay, we understood what you're doing. The Labour Party seems to be returning to mainstream positioning. But at the time, it was a huge moral dilemma.
Yeah. But how would you say the situation today is like?
So the situation. So I don't want to be too starry-eyed about it. So the situation at in terms of the leadership at the top of the party is that there is a very clear political commitment to deal with this. From Keir Starmer, our new leader, from the majority on the party national executive, we had some internal elections, and I came top in the ballot of party members in November. The fact that I can do that with the day job and the very clear positioning that I have on this issue suggests, the party's changing quite a bit. And the new general secretary of the party is very concerned to deal with anti-Semitism. So the politics at the top has changed. The politics in the local parties is changing a little bit more slowly, and there is still resistance to the idea that this is even a genuine problem. So there are people who will argue against the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, people who will say there isn't anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, it's all been invented by Blairites or by Zionists to kind of harm the left of the party and to harm Jeremy Corbyn, or people who will say, actually we're just being very vociferous in our support of the Palestinians. We're not being anti-Semitic. So there's a whole there are problems still out there. There's a lot of disciplinary action that's going to need to be taken to remove people that have expressed anti-Semitic views in the party. What has also changed, other than the general election defeat, wasn't wholly caused. Anti-Semitism was a factor, but it's actually a lot more to do with Brexit and to do with generally the Labour Party being too rhetorically left-wing for most middle-of-the-road British voters. But it triggered an understanding amongst the party membership they needed to move the party back to a more mainstream position. So one factor is the party kind of waking up and going, oh, the British electorate just told us they really hated the politics that Jeremy represented, we better change. The other factor is actually a legal process. So the Jewish Labour movement, which is the affiliate to the Labour Party that's been affiliated to us for 100 years now, for Jewish members, it used to be called Pol Zion, so it's a explicitly pro-Zionist as well as Jewish organisation. They brought a legal case to the Equality and Human Rights Commission, which is the British government body set up when we were in government, when we had a Labour government, set up to be the watchdog against all kinds of discrimination in the UK. And the EHRC did a 2-year review, and this is really tragic that the Labour Party is the only party in the UK, other than the British National Party, which is the neo-Nazi party in the UK, to have been found guilty of by the EHRC. And the EHRC issued a report in October, I think it was, that said that Labour had, under Corbyn, had indirectly discriminated against because its disciplinary process didn't work, and harassed and victimized Jewish members. And it said that we were responsible for the party couldn't say, oh, this was just some of our members being mean to other members, because any member who is an officer from branch level upwards, like a chair or a secretary or whatever, or is even a local councillor, all of them are considered in British law to be agents of the Labour Party, and we're responsible for their behaviour. So if under Corbyn we didn't stop them from harassing or victimizing Jewish members, that's our problem as a party. We're legally responsible, and now we have a action plan that the party had to agree with the EHRC of how we're going to address this racism within our ranks. I mean, the whole thing to me is completely shocking, because it should be central to being a social democrat or a democratic socialist that you're completely anti-racist. It's like central to our philosophy that we believe everyone is equal and we don't discriminate against people. So how the main centre-left party in the UK could end up in a situation where it is found guilty of discrimination is hugely shocking.
Mm. So, of course, the reports during that time was also in the news here in Sweden. And some people here in Sweden have also tried to debate this issue. And they claim some kind of conspiracy theory that it's right-wing people who, as you mentioned, have tried to attack and exaggerated all of this just because there's a left-wing radical who is now the leader of the Labour Party. So if people who listen to this webinar hears this argument from someone, what would be your suggestion for a response to it?
But I think it's really sad if you can't do being radically left-wing and wanting a completely different kind of society and a different economic and social future, and you can't do wanting justice for the Palestinians or fairness in foreign policy. If you can't do that, we're drifting into anti-Semitism that completely alienates Jewish people. I mean, there are Jewish people in the Labour Party who are miles to my left. It's like, I make no secret, I'm on the centre-left wing of the bit of the Labour Party that's nearest the centre of the whole UK political spectrum. That is where I come from in terms of traditions within the party. But the Jewish people who felt affected with this, I've had people who were on the extreme left of the Labour Party who, prior to 2015, they dreamed of Jeremy Corbyn becoming the leader. This was it was their dream come true. And the last 5 years, they then discover there's this anti-Semitic undertone to some of the Corbynite left that has had a devastating psychological effect on them. People rung me in tears about it, saying, "Luke, we thought you were exaggerating in the past, and then this has happened to us in party meetings." The young people around the JLM, around the Jewish Labour movement, lots of them are very left-wing on Israel. They're Zionists. They think Israel should exist. They're extremely critical of the Israeli government and of the occupation, and really keen to get a two-state solution as quickly as possible. These people were victimized and harassed during this period, and it's like, for me, how can it not be possible to promote a left-wing version of socialism that doesn't involve conspiracy theories and tropes about Jews? This is what August Bebel, the German social democrat in the 1890s, he described it as the socialism of fools. So this stuff pre-existed Israel. There were anti-Semitic conspiracy theories existing on the left that kind of personalized capitalism and didn't have like a systematic analysis of the problems of capitalism. It said, it's all about some guys who are the evil of particular people that are in the banking industry or whatever. And guess what? They all happen to be Jewish. So it's like an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that's non-Israel related. We've seen stuff like that going around. It's very old. It's been around on the edges of the socialist movement for a long time, and it's crazy and needs to be and vile and needs to be got rid of. And I just think, you can promote a different, better kind of society without having to promote that kind of stuff. And then just on the narrow stuff around Israel, I don't understand how, or there are plenty of people who manage to advocate for the Palestinians, who manage to be very critical of Israel and are sensitive to the fact that when you're talking about the world's only Jewish state, you need to make sure that you avoid anything that is anti-Semitic, and that they've studied anti-Semitism and its modern versions, and they avoid and remove from their discourse anything that's anti-Semitic, and I actually think it really lets the Palestinians down and totally undermines their cause and their chances of achieving a state if they have people running around saying, "Oh, I am a pro-Palestinian activist," and actually what it turns out is they're anti-Israel, they're anti-Jewish, they're not really making the positive case about the Palestinians at all. They're just saying vile things about Israel because it is a Jewish state.
Yeah. So let's leave the Corbyn issue, and one reason I wanted to talk to you.
We don't have to keep thinking about Jeremy Corbyn. Is thankfully that period has passed.
So one reason I chose to have you on this first webinar was to learn from your campaigning and so on. And when we first got in touch, you recommended one of the booklets that you have that is about the conflict, of course. And it ended up that we printed it and sent to all of our members, and we sent to all of the Labour MPs here in Sweden. And I also found out that you have a really good guide that is actually on campaigning, that is also available on your website. So can you describe this, because you told me that they have been very successful?
Yeah, sure. So the way to find them is to go into, so the website address is www.webelievein.israel.org.uk, and then there's a tab at the top that says resources, and the two documents that Christopher has been describing, the one that's about campaigning, but it has some kind of Q&A section or frequently asked questions section in it, as well as some practical campaign tips, is called our organizing manual. I think that's what we're calling it now. We changed the name a couple of years ago, which is the tab in the center of that, at the top of that page. And then if you look down the other publications, there is a booklet that we are now on edition kind of 2.2 of, which is called Israel and the Palestinians, A Guide to the Debate. And that's written by Professor Alan Johnson, who is one of my colleagues at BICOM, Senior Research Fellow at BICOM. In case anyone follows British politics really, really closely, we had a famous Labour politician called Alan Johnson, and it's not the same person, which is why it's not that he's got a big ego that he's mentioning that he's a professor. It's like really important so that people don't think they're reading something by the guy that used to be the Home Secretary or whatever. And Professor Alan Johnson, he actually comes from a kind of far left background. So we have one small Trotskyist group in the UK called Alliance for Workers' Liberty, who are completely unlike all the other far left groups in that they understand, like, they wouldn't say they were Zionists, but they would say they understand and are sympathetic towards Zionism, and are very much promoting a two-state solution. And Alan grew up in that organization. He's not in it anymore, but he grew up in that organization in the 1980s. So he kind of understands how to debate with people that are to the left of social democrats. And the booklet, it's not a book, it's like 60, 70 pages or something. I forget quite how long it is, but it's a short read that you could read on a flight, or once we're allowed to fly anywhere again when COVID disappears, or you could read it on the beach in one morning once we're allowed to go to beaches again. And it's aimed at a centre-left audience, so he was thinking of people on the centre-left, or he's thinking about students and a kind of university audience who turn up on campus and they're hearing about BDS and stuff for the first time. So it tackles some of the history, kind of what is Zionism, how did Israel get created. It tackles some specific stuff around Gaza and why the situation in Gaza is the way that it is. It tackles stuff around the two-state solution, around BDS, and around the anti-Semitic variants of anti-Zionism. So really, if you want to get to grips with the subject, that's a really good jumping off point. And as I say, is written for people from our political family to speak the same language as them and deal with the concerns that they have. So I hope people will go and read it. It's something we're really proud of, and also that you will try and get it out to other people who it ought to be something that anyone that's kind of open-minded enough that they want to hear the other side of the argument ought to read it.
And when I did the research before this webinar, I went to your page, and on one of the sites you said, we believe that dialogue and conversation with Israel's critics and the undecided and unengaged, and acknowledging and addressing their concerns is a better strategy than confrontation. Can you tell me a little bit about how you thought about that?
I mean, you have to make a judgment call about it. There's no point trying to get into a dialogue with people who are very locked into a particular ideological viewpoint and are never going to shift from it, and it's central to their sense of who they are to be an anti-Zionist or whatever. Then probably you're wasting their time and your own. I mean, it can be good for kind of practicing the arguments to debate with someone that's very rigid, and it's more, there's a lot of soft anti-Israelism out there in countries like the UK and Sweden, of just like a sort of baseline viewpoint among well-meaning people on the centre left, that they've only really heard Israel presented as like a very aggressive kind of militarized country, the Palestinians completely as the victims. They sort of connect it with, they probably don't buy into the full ideological stuff that it's completely apartheid, but they might have heard that argument, and it might resonate with them that it's somehow a kind of colonial problem, so they don't really understand where the Jewish people come from or their connection to the land of Israel, because once you understand that, you're not going to think it's colonial, because it's people with a deep connection to the region, and those people, you need to try to take them on a bit of a journey with which, if you jump straight in as your worldview is completely wrong, they're probably going to walk away. Whereas if you start saying, well, so why do you think this about Israel? What's at the roots of your concerns? Do you understand the story of the Jewish people and the story of the creation of Israel and why it happened? Do you understand what's happened in the interim in terms of the wars that have happened and the terrorism that's happened? And how do you see if you are someone that believes in human rights and justice, what does a just solution to this conflict look like? What does a solution that respects the human rights of both sides look like? And often you will find that quite quickly you get to a position where the core ideology is perhaps not that different from you if you're a two-stater, that often those people can accept the idea of two states quite quickly, and then you can have, once you discover that you're actually ideologically not that far apart, it's about the narrative that that you're looking at, you can start to move them into a more sympathetic and balanced position. And it's like, we're not trying to get people to all suddenly get up each morning thinking, I'm a Zionist, I really love Israel, I'm going to wave a flag or whatever. That's not realistic. We're trying to get people to be fair, to be balanced, to hear both sides of the story, and to understand that tactics like BDS are aimed at destroying Israel, not at creating a two-state solution, and that they're fundamentally negative tactics that are actually deeply unfair on they're hurting organizations that should be our friends in Israel, and they're hurting people that should be our friends in Israel, because what happens if you're on the center left and you start getting involved in boycotts, You boycott the people that you might otherwise meet in Israel. So they're not, I'm going to use kind of left-wing, like the military-industrial complex. You're not, the kind of people that do boycotting, they're not boycotting the IDF or boycotting the Likud or Benjamin Netanyahu or whatever. If you're in, what's your trade union, LO, and you wanted to boycott, or British TUC, and you get involved in boycotts, you end up boycotting the Histadrut, the Israeli trade union movement, which is really pro-peace, has great relationships with the Palestinian trade unions, and is incredibly radical in terms of what it does on social justice and workers' rights, for Israelis and Palestinians. So you boycott the wrong person. If you're like in the arts world and you're a painter or writer or someone that writes plays or does TV programs or whatever in Sweden or the UK, and you want to boycott Israel, who do you boycott? Israeli art galleries, Israeli theatres, Israeli dance troupes, Israeli painters or whatever. You're boycotting. They're so left-wing, the kind of cultural intelligentsia in Tel Aviv. They're probably more left-wing than the cultural intelligentsia in Stockholm or North London. Or if you, or if you're a university academic, because a lot of this stuff happens on campus, and you want to boycott Israel, who do you boycott? Your Israeli counterparts. So you end up, you're not boycotting someone right-wing if you're a sociology professor at Uppsala University or whatever. You end up boycotting a left-wing sociology professor at Ben Gurion University, who you previously would have been like doing joint research projects with. The whole thing is really destructive and totally lacking in the spirit of solidarity that should be in the way that anyone from the centre left does international work.
Yeah, and now we're reaching the end of this webinar. So I just wanted to, what would you like to say to the people who want to support your organization or follow your work?
Okay, so do feel free to sign up for our emails. Some of the stuff that we send around is like specific to the UK. Clearly, if we send around a campaign and it's and it's right to your MP, that's not. You need a tailored Swedish version of that understands your political system. But some of the information that we send around may well be useful. I'm sure Christopher will, if he sees it, might repackage it and use it. I think it's kind of build structures that I mean, the situation in Sweden, whilst you haven't had the phenomenon of Corbyn and this capture of a major political party by people that are anti-Semitic, anti-Zionists, it's like my understanding of the political situation in Sweden is that the kind of pro-Israel forces are weaker, that the sort of general political vibe is substantially more critical and less likely to have heard a pro-Israel perspective, not least because your Jewish community is so much smaller than in the UK. So I actually think the kind of building blocks are more about education in Sweden at the moment. It's more about trying to get people from the Israeli left to come and speak, and, particularly like on the trade union side, Peter Lerner, who's the head of international for the Histadrut, would be a great person to get in front of people from the Swedish trade unions. I think trying to get people to open their minds, not to feel they're having to abandon the Palestinians. We're not asking people to stop caring about the Palestinians, to stop wanting a just solution that is good for both sides. We're asking them to understand that there are two sides to a very complex conflict, and to study it in more detail, and to kind of have some sympathy for both peoples, who both peoples are victims of terrible things that have happened in the last 100 years, and they're locked in a conflict, and they need the kind of solidarity that's showing understanding to both of them, rather than kind of picking a side and flag waving. And I think it's remarkable and impressive that you're starting to do this work in a really difficult political environment. If I thought I had a difficult political environment on the left in Britain, I know from my contacts in the Social Democratic Party is a more difficult challenge to shift the debate there. And I'm really pleased that some of the resources that we've developed are useful to you. So I hope people will keep in touch. The sign up is on the front. If you want to join our email list, is on the front of the webelieveInIsrael.org.uk website. My email address is luke@webelieveInIsrael.org.uk. Very happy to answer questions via email after this, because I'm conscious that this was like a kind of moderated conversation, and some of you may have had more detailed things that you want to ask me after the event.
Yeah, thank you very much. And you have mentioned Histadrut here, and we're actually going to have more webinars in a series after this one. And in one of those, we're going to have a guest from Histadrut. So if you want to follow our webinars, you should like our Facebook page or follow it at least. And then you will get invited to the events and find out about it. So thank you again, Luke, for taking time, and best luck to all of the people who have listened to this.
Thank you. Really nice to have spoken to you all.